Hi, my name's Jennifer Doyle. I'm here to talk about the film Rape. I'm just going to dive in. I'm stopping myself from the preamble, which I've just done, so I failed to stop myself. So I have a couple opening paragraphs that I should just give this warning because there are a couple people who will know this writing. I published a book in August called Shadow of My Shadow. This talk is a mashup of that writing and discussion of the film Rape. I'm not a Yoko Ono expert, but you'll get it in a second. Okay, so I've called the opening paragraphs of this "Why Me?" If all you knew about stalking was what you learned from Law and Order, Dirty John, or Snapped, you would think that most victims are terrified that they will be killed. There is a strong relationship between stalking and violence. Murder victims are often stalked before the big event. But that is not what keeps a victim up at night. When asked to describe what most haunts them, victims lead not with the fear that they will be hurt. They lead with the anxiety of not knowing what is going to happen. And right behind that is the fear that it will never end. These are the conditions of being afraid of living. Stalking is persistent, intrusive behavior which robs its victim of a sense of privacy and/or safety. It is an intense form of non-consensual relation. Legal definitions abound, but these are not compelling descriptions of what stalking feels like for the victim. You know you are being stalked when you feel not only pursued, but threatened with a sense of a dreadful possibility that you can not fully grasp. You feel like the skin has been peeled off your sense of self. This can be debilitating, but it can also be a weird gift. Victims describe the experience as having reformatted their sense of self, and that was certainly true for me. I was stalked by a student, and at work, I got caught in a maw of procedure and the unnerving forms of fear, anxiety, and distrust that define the experience of being stalked migrated into my workplace. It disturbed my relationship to writing, teaching, and mentoring. I tried to find ways to restore my relationship to my job and then struggled to accept that in important ways, that damage is permanent. When I write about this sphere of experience, I confront things that are particular to the situation of the harassed. Creepy energy clings to victims. It is hard to write about harassment without drawing from the economies of sensation that amplify its debilitating effects. And I've already done this. These opening paragraphs, which are lifted right from the introduction to the book, play to the inherent interest of a stalking case. So when Tavia Nyong'o reached out to ask me if I could talk about film number 5, Rape or Chase, I did not need to ask, why me? I've written about art and sex, including artwork about sexual violation. I wrote a book about difficulty in art that is about hard subjects like abortion, and art that makes people uneasy, angry, or sad. And over the past decade, I've shifted the focus of my writing actually away from art to harassment, sexual violence, and stalking. That is why I was invited to talk about this film. I've been in this space for a while. And one would actually be within their rights to ask me why I've never written about this work before. And the truth is, I've actually deliberately avoided it. I tried to watch it about 20 years ago when there was I think a bootleg copy maybe on UbuWeb, but I couldn't finish it. And that's not because the film is that difficult. It's actually far less sensational than its title, which is part of the film's point. Some part of me, a kind of ancient part of me, though, was afraid of where the film was going. When you watch the whole thing, it's not as bad as you think it's going to be, but if you turn away, you let the worst flood into the space of what your sense of the film is. Nevertheless, even as I've kind of downplayed how hard it is, Rape, with that title and with its premise, this is a work about harassment, and it is a harassing work. When we talk about this work, we have to talk about harassment, rape, stalking, and murder. These subjects haunt the film in a way that breaks out of its frame and ripples across time. And I'm going to say, like, just as I've been thinking about this work and then also thinking about the tension and the distance between this film and the kind of work that Midori was just talking about in her amazing lecture about Yoko Ono's peace practice, I've been thinking about, I've been kind of turning over in my head the way that so much of her work, and I would say not including this film, works as devices for living in a world that would demand of you would ask you to be in the most kind of paranoid relationship to that world, right? That's as part of a kind of a resistance tactic. And so I really appreciated that lecture because it helped me to sort of think about that. So this is also, I just want to say too, I've really struggled to write about this work. And so that's partly why there's so much of my own already existing writing here. And maybe that means I've been thinking about this work for 20 years and just delaying the process of writing about it. So film number 5, Rape or Chase, is usually referred to simply as rape. The film is based on these directions from 13 film scores. The idea, rape with a camera, a set of instructions which map an idea for not just a film, but a kind of film or filmic situations. Quote, a cameraman chases a girl on a street with a camera persistently until he corners her in an alley and, if possible, until she is in a falling position, end quote. The pace of the film will wind down, motion will be slowed and slowed again. This can be done with girls of different ages, boys and men too, because in truth, rape can happen to anyone. We can imagine a series, films executed like a game in which the object is to corner your subject, an avant-garde special victims unit. Ideally, this would be a series that no one would want to watch, but that, of course, is the problem. We know from the detectives of SVU, Law and Order's longest-running franchise, the appetite for this kind of procedural is bottomless. Rape with a camera is the genre of genres. Rape is a bad dream we dream together. The idea for this film is that a woman will be followed until she collapses. We can think of any number of situations in which we've watched this happen. Britney Spears, most infamously, who shaved her head in 2007 at a salon while being photographed by the paparazzi. This was a way to wrestle back some of the agency and control over the image of herself, but of course even that image was taken and emptied out. Celebrities are subject to stalking on an industrial scale. Anti-stalking laws handle that industry's off-gas. Stalking entered the mainstream after the murder of Rebecca Schaeffer, the popular and lovable star of the CBS sitcom My Sister Sam. On July 18, 1989, she was shot on the doorstep of her home by Robert Bardo. Bardo was given a life sentence. He was actually prosecuted by Marcia Clark, who would later prosecute O.J. Simpson. The first anti-stalking laws were passed in the state of California in the wake of Rebecca Schaeffer's death. California's anti-stalking laws are important as the first, but they are actually relatively soft, and this is because celebrities live there. Media coverage of celebrity life requires that they be stalked. There has been a reluctance in my home state to pass tougher anti-harassment legislation which might support celebrity privacy, especially when out in public. Ono has said in interviews that the idea for this film came to her before she was herself harassed by cameras, before, in her words, she entered into, quote, this strange exploitative atmosphere, end quote, the atmosphere of celebrity in which she was cast as John Lennon's disturbing shadow. She has also said that this film feels like a forecast, and for this reason, she can't watch it. Ono and Lennon realized this idea for a rape with a camera with support from an Austrian television station, which commissioned a work from Ono and gave her, wonderfully, carte blanche. I'm just going to stop here just to say, I want to put this in some kind of pantheon of the most intense artworks produced by a heterosexual couple. It's really interesting in that score because it's kind of a work of love, too. The first few times that her cameraman tried to execute the script, he failed. I'm leaving a lot of biographical facts out of this, and because I'm assuming there's a group of people here who kind of know that, and I want to focus just on the action of the film. But this is part of the lore of the film, is that kind of a trusted cameraman tried to do this, and then he would see girls across the street and just not want to cross the street with a camera and pursue them, and then he would go back to her with the footage of the day. She was in a hospital at the time. She had suffered a miscarriage, and she was like, no, you have to go further, and she was trying to push him. Eventually they switched tactics, and instead of following a random person encountered on the street, a two-person crew followed the sister of a friend of Ono and Lennon's. The film, this is why I kind of used the word GIF, because I made GIFs. I'm sorry, I've discovered a website where you could do that really easily, and you're going to get a bunch of them. And I want to say I've often slowed down the speed of them because the film is very, it's a little hard to watch if you watch it at regular speed, so I just slowed it down. So the film is episodic. It has only a loose sense of continuity as it offers us one scene after another in which she is followed. Harassed with a camera. We see her walking, turning and facing the camera. She laughs them off. She pleads with them. She turns her back and continues on her way. The crew follows her along London sidewalks into a cemetery. She ignores them. She tries to shake them off. She walks through tall grass and weeds. She sits on the ground. She gets into a cab, and they follow her. She goes into what looks like a shop, and they follow her there. They seem to be everywhere that she is. Because the crew is following her, her back is often to the camera, but over and over again, they overtake her, and it feels like they are trying to corner her with the camera and to get her face. Watching this film can thus make you dizzy as she turns away from them and as they turn around her. It feels like the movement of paparazzi. The subject of this film is beautiful. She's got fabulous eye makeup, she's fashionable, and she looks great even when she's upset. She tells them to stop and leave her alone. She asks them what they are doing and why. At least that's what it feels like she's doing. She speaks a language that I don't recognize, Hungarian, and also sometimes Italian, German, and a little English. The crew never acknowledges or responds to her verbally. When we see or hear the crew, it is because they are marking the start of a reel. This makes the fact that they do not speak to her feel very purposeful and menacing. Not knowing her language seems to make this rape with camera easier, and maybe it makes things easier on us too as we watch. At about 40 minutes, things shift. The camera crew knocks on an apartment door and then uses a key. They pan around, move from room to room, and they find her, and she seems surprised, angry, and demoralized. She tries to get out and can't open the door, and we don't know why. They are often so close to her in this last section of the film that she is hard to see. The struggle between the film's subject and the camera becomes very physical here, even if there's no physical contact between them. She scurries back and forth between the door, that red door, and a window across the room. She runs around a corner into another room, and they keep chasing her. This goes on for, I think, about over 20 minutes until she is sitting down with her hands over her face. She moves those hands to bring her long hair over them, making a curtain. Sorry. Right, so there the camera moves in and the screen goes black, and that's the first time you see the word rape. Sorry, I'm going to take a water break. So I'm switching gears here again, and I'm sharing writing about, some of my writing about rape, and writing about rape. So the Italian writer Elsa Morante's 1974 novel, La Storia, History, a Novel, examines the lives of a poor Roman family living through World War II. It opens with, and I want to pause here too, because like the end of the session, somebody asked, like, why in this moment make art? And so there was a pretty sincere and open conversation that happened at the end of the last panel. And one of the things I want to kind of flag is the kind of looming presence of the fascist regimes and World War in her work, and also the work I'm just about to discuss. So this novel, it opens with nearly 100 pages of writing that describes the story of a rape. A German soldier is looking for company, and he stumbles onto an Italian woman who is about to enter her apartment building. He coerces her into inviting him into her home, and then he assaults her. Neither speaks the other's language. The rape has 2 stages. The soldier penetrates Ida in a physically violent assault, and then he has sex with her again in a manner intended to draw pleasure from her as if in apology. The story of the rape in this novel is complicated by the fact that Ida is epileptic. She has a seizure during the first assault, and so she has no memory of it beyond that it happened. And she experiences the second during that seizure's post-ictal phase, and so her memory of that assault is very watery, fantastical, and dreamlike. As the novelist moves between the soldier's perspective and Ida's, the reader learns that their inability to understand each other is a crucial condition of possibility for the rape. Ida, who had been keeping her Jewish heritage a secret, is scared of the soldier and experiences his attempt at seduction through a mute and absolute terror. She allows him into her apartment because she does not feel as if she has any choice. Gunther, the German soldier, has no awareness of what his uniform means to her, and so her responses to him confuse and then frustrate him. The disaster of their encounter is escalated by her seizure. She cries out no as she feels it coming on, and that is actually when the first assault begins. As if activated by a primitive mechanism, he rapes her in response to that no. Afterwards, completely, he's like just totally oblivious to what he's done. He fixes a lamp in her apartment and exchanges mementos. He leaves her his treasured pocket knife, and he takes a fading flower from a bouquet on the table. So as a wonderful critic named Lydia Oram writes in her analyses of this part of this novel, he's a paradoxically innocent assailant, and that's a kind of a characteristic of kind of rape culture, rape narrative, which is the privilege of not knowing what you're doing. So he's totally unaware of his crime, but he dies in the war just a few days later. Ida, however, spends the rest of her life marked by the shame and the trauma of the experience and by the fear that he could return. She's haunted. History is written onto Ida's body by that rape, and one can read in that rape the whole history of Rome. Rape narratives have this capacity to isolate, to sink into the body, and to transform that violated body into a national allegory. Sharon Marcus, in her widely discussed in feminist theory, and she has an essay called Fighting Bodies, Fighting Words, Towards a Theory of Rape Prevention. There she addresses the debilitating character of discourse on rape. Rape culture normalizes the positioning of women as objects of violence rather than as agentic subjects within violence. So this kind of like is in a kind of a tension, actually, with Ono's practice. Insofar as that, well, in a lot of feminist like rape prevention discourse, there's actually an attention to, there's a training of people in self-defense, right, which is to learn how to, in essence, play with violence. Not saying it's a contradiction, but more of a tension. Right, so sexual violence within rape culture and its cousin, which is law and order feminism, is taken to be a fundamental and defining aspect of women's being and an expression of a woman's place within an organic distribution of power. Even this liberal feminist discourse, which seeks to protect women, right, and organize itself around the idea of protecting women and girls, produces a sense of futility. Rape seems to be taken for granted as an occurrence, as inevitable. So rape gets reified as, quote, terrifyingly unnameable and unrepresentable, a reality that lies beyond our grasp and which we only experience as grasping and encircling us. Those are Marcus's words. This line of thinking, Marcus continues, often concurs with masculinist culture in its designation of rape as a fate worse than or tantamount to death. The apocalyptic tone which it adopts and the metaphysical status which it assigns to rape implies that rape can only be feared or legally repaired, but not fought. Skeptics tend to universalize expressions of masculinist power, Abuse dynamics are folded into a sense of sex as an expression of inherent power differentials. Power, in this view, is in and of itself sexy. Victims in these narratives suffer from their own naivete or from a confusion about the nature of their real desires. These narratives, furthermore, tend to lean on legal discourse and the law about rape as if its structures and requirements were the best tools available with which we could account for sexual abuse and harassment. The importance of the term beyond a reasonable doubt specific to the requirements for the finding of guilt within a criminal court system in the United States is expanded within skeptical discourse to authorize a decredentialization of victim narratives in social and professional contexts. One should, in general, be suspicious of people who mobilize the language of the criminal court system to legitimize their positions vis-a-vis sexual violence. At minimum, it betrays an identification with patriarchal and racist structures of power. The transformation of those structures is initiated by other rituals, other forms of truth, and I would say actually by films like this and by practices like wish trees. Marcus theorizes rape as an articulation of power, as an iteration of conventional gendered structures of feeling and action. Its grammar shapes our sense of the possible and is written into the body. The language of rape speaks through us, she writes, quote, freezing our sense of force and affecting the would-be rapist's perception of our lack of strength, end quote. She is thinking of, we should think of the dominant discourse of rape as a specific organization of the relationship of sex, violence, gender, and truth. Rape appears in this discursive world as the real. It grounds a language of violence and draws language's limits. This sense of rape is a defining element in the pessimism which clings to heterosexist and white supremacist thinking. A sense of gender difference is rooted in an absolute and unchangeable vulnerability, expressing racial privilege and enabling racialized violence. The discourse of rape isolates rape from a continuum of violence, claims sex for itself in order to redistribute to those in a hierarchical system, and forces the rapeable into an ontological and epistemological corner, meaning a corner that's defined by problems of being and knowing. Within the discourse of rape, rape is your truth in a way that the telling of it can never be. This whirlpool distorts our thinking about everything touched by the discourse of rape. It exerts a definitional force on our experiences of sexual harassment, our sense of sexual happiness, intimacy, and truth. Rape culture alibis harassment. It manifests as authority and entitlement. It names forms of sexual violence, some forms of sexual violence rape, and others ritual. It cements woman to rape and spins out crazy narratives of biology and destiny, wrapping its arms around the idea of man, woman, sex. And so many of us hold experiences of violation close, withholding the memory of violation from language, with the hope that in doing so, we will avoid being sucked into rape culture's engine. You cannot write about this film, which does not depict a rape, without writing about rape. Rape is everywhere in this film, and it is nowhere. That is one thing that the film visualizes for us, the structure and the trap of this discourse. The film provokes all kinds of forensic curiosities. Is this really rape with a camera? Is this woman really being harassed? Or is this woman playing at being harassed? If it's a setup, then is the viewer cheated? Why doesn't she fight back? Why does no one stop the crew from following her? How do they get into her apartment? What does that even mean? Do you believe her? Asking this, isn't this also harassing? Holding all this in mind, one might argue that the most radical thing about this film is embedded in that score, in that sense of this script. As gendered as it seems, it is not absolutely about gender. John Lennon said as much in kind of publicity around the broadcast of the film on Austrian television. When asked to comment on the film, he said, "What's happening to this girl on the street is happening in Biafra, Vietnam, everywhere." Okay, so I'm going to switch gears, and this is and talk about Ava. Sorry, I'm going to take a drink of water. This is kind of brutal. So the name of the woman who is the subject of this film appears in the credits. That's the first time we learn of her name. Eva Moitlat was born in Hungary in 1943. In 1956, student demonstrations against Soviet rule grew into a broad revolt, the Hungarian Revolution. This resistance triggered the collapse of the government. The movement was quashed days later when Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest, and 200,000 people fled for Austria and Yugoslavia, including Eva and her family. Eva studied acting at the Max Reinhardt Seminar in Vienna. She moved to London following her sister Judith. Her sister, this is the sister who was the friend of Ono and Lennon's, who helped them make the film by setting Eva up. Sorry, I'm just making sure I know where I am. Yeah, okay. When they made this film, Eva was working as a model, but her participation in an Ono and Lennon collaboration made her into a minor celebrity. News articles describe her as a beauty queen, actress, and socialite on the swinging 60s West End scene. And every time like the film was screened, sort of in the 2000s, in the early 2000s in particular, you would get a round of kind of sensationalist news articles, right, about this film and about this model who was in this film. So she married an architect named Mark Rhodes, and she became an antiques dealer. They divorced, and she kept her married name and her British citizenship. And she moved back to Hungary in the late 1990s, establishing the Puss in Boots Animal Trust and Sanctuary. She saw this work as contributing to a much-needed culture shift in Hungary, where animal cruelty was in the day-to-day normalized. She was renowned in her community for this dedication to animal welfare, and she was a public figure in Hungary. And by now, you may notice that I've slipped into using the past tense. Eva Rhodes was last seen alive on September 10th, 2008. Soon thereafter, her sister Judith filed a missing persons report. Months went by, and the police seemed to do nothing. Her sister did not believe that the police were really investigating Eva's disappearance. She had every reason to not trust them. Eva's animal rights activism had put her at odds with the police and with gangs involved with puppy mills and dogfighting. Over many years, Eva had been subject to harassment and death threats, and in 2002, a policeman invaded their home. Her daughter was brutally beaten trying to protect her mother in what they described as a Rambo-like attack. Her daughter was charged by the police with assault. The harassment to which they had been subjected was persistent and severe, and given the role of the police in that harassment, Eva and her daughter turned to the European Court of Human Rights for relief. Police responded to this by filing more complaints against them. This escalation of mirrored complaints is itself a paradigmatic harassment dynamic. At the time of Eva, I'm skipping ahead, sorry. Judith, Eva's sister, is a prominent activist who was awarded a Nobel Prize for her work to fight in the fight to ban landmines, a struggle that was actually referenced in the War is Over video, meaning there were shots of landmines. And so she was part of a team that got that Nobel in 1997. So in her last conversation with her sister, Judith had urged Eva to leave Hungary. She was afraid that the people harassing her, the police, would kill her. After her disappearance, Judith hounded the police and she loudly criticized them and sought publicity to put the spotlight on their sham investigation. And the head of the police department responded by threatening to file charges against Judith. In March 2009, she filed an application for a murder investigation. Her sister had still not been found. That application was denied. The Hungarian police refused to cooperate with Scotland Yard, who were inquiring after Eva because she was a British citizen. And in fact, not only had the Hungarian police not seriously investigated Eva's disappearance, they actually issued a warrant for Eva and her daughter during the period in which no one knew where she was, in retaliation for the charges that they had brought against one of her officers. So this is a warrant that was issued after she disappeared. And this seems to have been an effort to kind of bolster the narrative that they were offering, which was that Eva, this animal rights activist, had actually abandoned her sanctuary. Ava's remains were found in March 2009, 8 months after her disappearance and death. She had been dismembered, her body burned, and her torso has never been recovered. Shaba Agostini, an employee of the animal rescue organization, confessed to killing her. He was convicted and sentenced to 10 years, and after the family pushed to have that sentence reassessed, he was sentenced to 13. Ava's family has been arguing for years that this man's confession is part of a cover-up. The murder, they argue, was never truly investigated, and they describe the trial itself as a sham designed to deflect attention from Horvan Zoltan Peter, the policeman whom they believe is largely responsible for her death. Peter retired from the police force at 40 years old shortly after her body was discovered. Her family successfully petitioned for a forensic examination of Ava's remains by Scotland Yard, and that report confirmed that she was murdered by more than one person and that her body was subjected to a level of violence that far exceeded what was described by Agostini in his confession. And that's where things stand, as far as I can tell. Julia, the sister who facilitated Ono and Lennon's access to Ava, is continuing to fight for justice for her sister, as far as I know, battling the everyday fascism of a fascist state, appealing directly to Viktor Orban, as if what happened to Ava was in itself an emblem for what had happened to Hungary. So it's a little short. I wanted to stop there because I know I just dropped a lot of very heavy stuff on there on you. But I found myself struggling to write about this because, as you can probably imagine, even just paying attention to this means really holding off paying attention to what happened to John Lennon and what also happened to Yoko Ono, right? And as I've been thinking about this, I've been thinking about it as this kind of like, I use the word ripple to talk about the way if you kind of watch rape and try to learn about the woman in rape, it ripples out to not only the story of what happened to her, but towards that the way in which the film feels like it has this Cassandra-like prophetic quality that Yoko Ono herself, she said this about her work in general, that it seems to anticipate her life. But I would say, and this is probably true of any kind of work that is about this subject, that has this name, and is situating itself in relationship to rape narrative, that it has this kind of forecasting power that's really hard to sit with. And so that's where I am with thinking about this film called Rape. Thank you. May be hard to slip into discussion, so I encourage taking maybe a deep breath, or at least I'm going to do that and have a glass of water. Yeah. That's her sister coming out of court. Sorry, and I held back on this one, which is a pretty disturbing quote. So I'm not going to keep that up there, but I just feel like that feels so familiar because it feels like a lot of the criminals running our country right now would say the same thing. That's more or less the arguments that they make about the law right now, is that they are the law, right? And so they cannot really be linked to its violation. I don't know that that's what he meant, but yeah. Yeah, so I mean, there may be people here who know this story better than I do. I wanted to just say, like, the information that I have is gleaned largely from a website that's maintained by Ava's family, and that material kind of stops. It's like around a decade old or a little less than that, so that there's not really been much recent posting or news articles about this. Yeah. Yeah, we have a, yes. Yeah, yes.
Can you talk about, has there been just a position where you're coming from in relationship to other writing about rape and unrepresentability?
Yeah.
Mika Bell comes to mind and Hathaway as two
Yeah.
important figures who theorize this. I'm not sure where I go with that.
Yeah.
Is that useful for you?
Yeah. I mean, I think, I think one of the things, and partly as a response maybe to this problem, that one of the things that's happened as I've been writing about harassment and rape is I've almost, it's like all that writing, and it's like, it started about 10 years ago. None of it, like Shadow of My Shadow doesn't have a single illustration, right? I talk there about an artist with whom I had a conversation, Adrian Howells, but that's about grief, no illustration, not about art. So my writing about harassment, rape, stalking, is not writing about art. This might be, this might grow into something in a sense because the film, it's partly because of, it's almost like the statement that wouldn't normally lean so hard on the artist's statement about a work, but the observation she makes about her work having this kind of prophetic value, right? It's the literary critic in me that responds to that, right? Because of course, the comp lit major in me, right, thinks of Cassandra and that mythological figure who is cursed by Apollo with the gift of prophecy that no one will believe. And so everything that she says about the future is correct, but no one believes her. And one of the kinds of effects of this, when you think about it in terms of a story, is that those prophecies don't land as a prophecy. Over time, people experience them as a curse, right? That she's not, that's, so which is, assigns to her discourse a kind of a power, but also it's like a negative force that has to be suppressed. I find myself thinking like that. I don't want to say I'm not interested in the art historical work, like there's I've forgotten her name. She wrote a book about women, like feminist artists and violence and sexual violence and art in the 1970s. It's a really fantastic book. Ixtamaya Murray has a book called We Make Each Other Beautiful. That's on art, activism, and the law. I'm interested in the work that those scholars are doing. Joan Key's essay on, Chasing the Law. This is from about 2003. This is to my mind, it's the most sustained discussion of the film and most carefully researched discussion of the film, kind of paying really close attention to the work itself, how it was produced. But she's thinking also about the law and the kinds of questions that get produced around sex offenses, sexual violence, and victimization. And she uses the law to kind of read and think about the film and vice versa. That's kind of, the most interesting criticism for me on the film tends to kind of step outside art history. I think there's good reason for that. When I think about artworks I've seen that touch the subject of rape and the difficulty around representation in rape, I love Elisa Schwartz's, is it called Anthem? It's a collection of rape test kits from every state. And then at a conference, I saw her do a performance in which she ran a rape test kit on herself. So it would be like if one of you just got up and stood in the middle of the room and ran the rape. She's not asserting a victim status, just executing, right, the instructions that are in the box on herself. And there were people in the room who were just leveled by it. So people do really interesting work around this, and I guess there's a part of me too, just on like a kind of a political level, I want to insist on, rape is absolutely representable. It's represented to us all the time, right? So there's a discourse of rape that presents it as unrepresentable. It's some like this kind of violation that nobody can speak or understand, right? But so if you've been through it, you could certainly draw a picture and put it in a sentence, right? But we kind of are in this world where we kind of reify this particular experience of rape, where there's this kind of heroic resistance to speaking the truth of it, right? That's the most kind of dignified sort of, unless you're in the proper, sorry, I could discourse about this for a really long time. I was going to try to wrestle myself, but that's like a socially prescribed relationship to the discourse, like to one's own victimization, unless you're in the witness box, right? And then you're in this kind of authorized machine, truth-telling machine that serves as kind of social function. That's like the reward of law and order, right? Is that the victim is going to get her day in court, and most of the time they're going to win, but sometimes maybe they're going to lose, which only lets you get a sense of the heroism of the fight. Anyway, sorry, I could go on and on about it, but there's just an excess of representation of sexual violence out there. It's one of the things that's so great about this film, right, is that it really, even there's a tendency when you write about it, I think it sounds more sensational than it really is, because they're running around with this camera on the street, like it's not like beautifully filmed in such a way that builds suspense. There's a menace to it. Like it feels like she's being kind of menaced, but then sometimes, sometimes she just kind of, just laughs at them, So it's, and I think it can be reassuring if you want to watch it to know, like, she's not going to be assaulted in the film, right? She's going to hide her face, right? That's like the destination of the film, as that she withdraws her face from them. Yeah, sorry, that's not really a direct answer to your question. So, but yeah. Yeah.
About what you recently, talking about modern times, and I don't want to get political in the room, but on January 31st, Education Department tells schools to change sexual misconduct rules.
Yeah.
That terrifies me.
Yeah.
We have a child in college,
Yeah.
and it's just an assault, an additional rape on what's happening right now to America. But I don't mean to get political, but it's just taking the conversation.
I'm going to go there with you. I really am, because like Ava, what happened to Ava happened in Hungary, right? That this is what happened to Ava happened because she got under the fascist skin, and she stood up for her life and for the animals that she was taking care of, and the people around her. She menaced them, and they were really threatened by her. That's one of the reasons why I felt I had to talk about Ava today, right? Because that is what's on the line right now. That really is what's on the line right now. What I would say about things like Title IX and all that, is to remember, and I would say this to the parents here, right? Lots of people like me are your kids' teachers. And lots of people like us are working in student affairs and in the counseling services, that the university itself is not the administrative apparatus that administers complaints. It's a lot more than that, and there are good people in there trying to administer those complaints, but, I think that's what I would, that's kind of what I would say. We're in a moment right now when we are watching institutions, this is the hard political thing that I'm going to say. It's like, we ourselves are implicated in a narrative in which, I'm going to say we kind of broadly, there's a lot of public hatred for the institution and the idea of the institution. Title IX, like the right, worked for decades to normalize the sense that the administration of sexual harassment complaints was like ridiculous and going to be the end of sex or the end of men's sports, or feminism was to be shoved down students' throats in the classroom. Like, right-wing think tanks have been working on making Title IX into a wedge issue for decades. Where they managed to do that is around rape and around trans people, right? They've managed to take the subject of sexual assault and the fact that trans people exist and turn that into a way to decredentialize Title IX. I'm not saying that Title IX is the point. The point are these institutions through which we connect with each other in our work and engage in the kind of the transformation of each other in the world, right? So I have a kind of dark side around this, which is that, the hatred of the institution is not enough. I'm quoting an intellectual I heard talk a couple weeks ago. But within these institutions, there are people who are working, for and alongside your students, and we're really committed to them. And in a weird way, I'm kind of not afraid of what they're going to do to Title IX. I'll just say that. Yeah.
That I could never pinpoint the language that she was speaking in the film. I caught the Italian, I caught the German, but then there was some kind of strange mix of all of them. I feel like it's a very loaded topic that I haven't looked into. I wonder if you can just touch a little bit more on that.
Thank you. That was like something I cut from the paper because it's like, it's really important, right? Because there's part of this, the lore around this is that she was nearing the end of her visa, and that she was afraid to get too controversial, confrontational with the crew because of this. I've never been able to figure out where that story comes from. Like when I kind of dig around, a lot of it doesn't, like that would be a question I would ask her sister. And like they were migrants, but they were from, like they were doing quite, it seems like they come from a pretty amazing family, so I don't want to say that they were super privileged, but they seemed really like two really strong, creative and interesting women, right? So there's a part of me that is like, I don't know, like, like I want to lead with the story of her vulnerability, but there's a really like, in England and the United States, it's a privilege that so many of us are monolingual, right? We speak, many people in England, English people are kind of notorious on this. It's like you're creating a situation in which the audience can legitimately say they don't know what she's saying, right? And especially because she's often saying it with a smile and a laugh, it gets kind of, I don't know what she's saying. Like, is she really saying, is she telling them no? Like, I don't understand. And that kind of moment of understanding is like part of like the architecture of, it can be a part of the architecture of rape scenario, the rape kind of script, insofar as the scripts of sexual violence in which the abusive person, right, the offender, I'm just putting that around because it's the language of the criminal justice system, but where a person says they didn't know what the victim said, right? They didn't hear or understand, right? So Eve Sedgwick has a lovely essay called The Privilege of Unknowing, which is I think it's kind of a deep cut in her archive because it's about a Diderot novel called The Nun. But it opens with language about the privilege of unknowing. And the anecdote she gives is about, I can't remember which president, but it's one in which the expectation is that he won't have to speak the language of the person, the state leader with whom he's talking, and that this is a kind of a privilege of unknowing. And then she moves from that to talking, she moves directly from that to talking about the education that men get within patriarchy to not know what sexual assault is. So I see that choice around language as, and I would assume this is something that she was immensely sensitive to, that was a strategic and a tactical decision. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
I wanted to go back for a second to this, the question of prophecy.
Yeah.
I'll just repeat that. I wanted to go back for a second to the question around prophecy, and I'm wondering if there's a frame where it's not so much a prophecy of what might happen to an individual person, an artist who, speaks of this, but rather that the work itself is a recognition of the pervasiveness of the threat and how the pervasiveness of that threat is actually leveled at, 50% of the population of the entire world constantly as a presence. So maybe the idea of prophecy in that sense, could that be challenged as more kind of like, yeah, this is something that's like happening all the time, and even if it's not happening to you, the threat of it is used as a way to control women. So I'm wondering if like there's another way to unpack the notion of prophecy. Is that too big of a question?
Yeah, that's a question I think I was asking for, really. Yeah, I mean, I find this film hard to write about because I was trying to like, what's the word for it? Because it's like she describes it as having a prophetic power, but well, and she says literally, like, what happens in this is what happened to me, right, to us and to me. But when writing about it, it feels also like a dream, right? A woman, it's like rape with a camera. A woman is being followed by a camera. So it has this kind of archetypal, fable-like feeling to it, which is true for a lot of lot of the things that she did, right, and a lot of the works of art that she produced. So one of the effects of that kind of structure, right, is that it feels like it has a timelessness to it, right? And here I would qualify that by saying, and this is historically like pretty much true. As long as you've had portable cameras, you've had this equation of filming, photographing women who are out in public as a form of sexual violation. There's a law review article called The Right to Privacy by Warren and Brandeis. It was late 19th century. And there are like key moments in it. They articulate the sense of the right to privacy in reaction to the development that it was like the earliest versions of the paparazzi. So these were, and it's not just like professional journalists, it'd be like people on the street, but you could buy in the late 19th century these like hidden these cameras that you could like hide in your suit, or it would look like a suitcase or a little box, but they were disguised. So they were called like detective cameras, and these guys were like plagued with worry about it. And one of them in particular, he had a society wife. Like his wife was constantly being reported in gossip rags, and they were worried. They were just like kind of plagued with this kind of anxiety about covert photography. So like there's a really amazing world of like writing about this, the relationship between paranoia, the sense of surveillance and control, sexual violation, and photography. And so there isn't, this goes back to Claire's question. I think like if I was going to think about art historically, I'd be thinking about it in relationship to the camera, right? And in relationship to anxieties about surveillance, and cameras and photography. And then one thing I would just want to say, like one of the difficult things with like rape culture, right, is that it reinscribes this sense that half the world is subjected to this, and it's like this kind of structural problem, and it's timeless, and it's like baked. It's like, you know, and I recommend to folks who've never read Silvia Federici's writing. She's a Marxist feminist, and one of the things that she does is historicizes misogyny. Is very dedicated to thinking about what does misogyny do? Like why do people need misogyny, right? And so she talks about misogyny and the hatred of women in relationship to the divorcing of people's relationship to resources and land. And she does this in a book called Caliban and the Witch, historicizing the witch hunt, and also in like shorter essays. That's also like some of those essays would be really interesting to read alongside this film. Yeah, so sorry, that's kind of, we could talk for a long time about your question. So I guess what I'm going with prophecy is it's like it forecasts, but it also forecasts through this kind of space where rape feels timeless and forever and always it's everywhere. So there's a weird time and timing situation that happens in this film, and I think in what it's called, right, the title of it is doing that. And then in Ono's narrations of it, because she says she came up with the idea before she was ever like kind of scrutinized in this way by paparazzi. That said, you know, it's hard for me to imagine any kind of account of her life that doesn't involve a kind of visibility problem that kind of clings to her. She moves through these patriarchal spaces with the commitment to the kind of work that she was doing, right? She was kind of very disruptive presence in her, what was often in a disturbingly quiet way. Yeah, so there was, yeah. 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 Yeah, I mean, you can just point to anti-trans rhetoric right there, right? It's like the idea, for example, that trans women athletes are a threat to girls and women athletes, right? I mean, it's deeply offensive on so many levels. It's offensive as it's just on the surface, just for the straight up transphobia of that, but it's also offensive for the gaslighting that does regarding the actual sexual violence to which girls and women in sports are subjected to, right? So we only need to mention the name Larry Nassar to give, you could just drop in the names of any, it's a whole battery of them, of coaches in elite sports and in youth sports. And that's also a problem for boys as well. There are horrific stories there, right? And the kind of reckoning that we do socially to confront that and to confront the ways in which abusive coaches, for example, right, are not just let to, ignored. They're actually rewarded and put in positions of authority and power. Luis Rubiales and the entire apparatus of the Spanish Football Federation. Those athletes were not allowed to lock their doors in their hotel rooms, right? So, that's an example where you have this idea of a feminine space, women's sports, or the women's bathroom that's being violated, and then it gets turned into a national issue, right? And a political one. Right? So, and again, it's why I wanted to talk about Ava, and Hungary, and try to find a way to get to these things. And again, the Midori's talk just was because I was oh my God, I can't believe I'm going to this Yoko Ono thing and I'm going to talk about this, about murder. I mean, that's just I was feeling when I went into that lecture that I was doing something disrespectful in a way, because it feels so out of step with what her work wants to be and do. But her talk really, was just this underscoring that comes from. It's not a place of avoidance, right? It's not a place of avoidance. So that was good for me to hear, yeah. Oh, and I'm going to answer that question about art that was asked in the last panel. If art didn't matter, you wouldn't have so many artists in prisons around the world, right? So it's something just to remember and to have faith in the value of what you do as an artist, all right? So I'll end there.